She walked out of that house with nothing but $10 in her pocket and a broken heart behind her, while the man who called himself her father laughed, convinced she would fail within days. But what he didn't realize was that every step she took away from that house was not defeated, was the beginning of something he could never imagine. Years later, when she finally returned, she didn't come back asking for forgiveness. She came back as the silent owner of everything he once controlled. I still remember the exact moment my world shifted, as if time slowed down just to make sure I felt every second of it. I was standing in the middle of our small, worn-out living room, holding a crumpled $10 bill in my hand. It didn't look like much, and honestly, it wasn't. But to me, it was everything I had left. My fingers tightened around it as if gripping it harder would somehow increase its value or give me a sense of security. The silence in the room felt heavy, like something was about to break. And then it did. My father looked at the money in my hand, then at my face. For a split second, I thought maybe, just maybe, he would understand. Maybe he would see that I was trying, that I wasn't lazy or useless like he always claimed. But instead, his lips curled into a mocking smile, and then he laughed. It wasn't a small laugh or a nervous one. It was loud, sharp, and filled with disbelief, like I had just proven his worst opinion of me to be true. "Is that all you have?" he said, shaking his head. $10? You think you can survive with that? You can't even take care of yourself." Each word hit me harder than the last. It wasn't just what he said, it was how easily he said it, like I meant nothing. Like I was a failure he had already given up on. I felt my chest tighten, but I refused to let my tears fall. I had cried too many times before, and it never changed anything. I glanced toward my mother, hoping for something, anything, a sign of support, a soft word, even a look that said she didn't agree with him. But she stayed silent, her eyes avoiding mine. It hurt more than my father's laughter. Her silence felt like agreement, like she had already decided I wasn't worth defending. Then I noticed my brother leaning against the wall, watching everything unfold. He wasn't saying anything either, but the smirk on his face said enough. To him, this was entertainment. I wasn't his sister in that moment. I was a joke. I felt something inside me shift. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was something deeper, something colder. A realization that I didn't belong here, not really. This house wasn't a home anymore. It was a place where I was constantly reminded of what I lacked, of what I wasn't. My father stepped closer, his voice now lower but still filled with judgment. "You want to act independent? Fine. Go out there and see how the real world treats you. You'll come running back in a week." That sentence stayed with me. Not because I believed it, but because of how certain he sounded. He had already decided my future, already written my failure in his mind. And for the first time, I felt a strong urge to prove him wrong, not by arguing, not by begging, but by leaving. I looked down at the $10 again. It suddenly felt heavier, like it carried the weight of my decision. It wasn't just money anymore. It was a line, a choice. Stay here and keep being the person they thought I was, or leave and become someone they never expected. Without saying another word, I turned and walked toward my room. My steps were steady, even though my heart was racing. I could still hear my father's voice in the background, still feel their eyes on me. But I didn't stop. Inside my room, everything looked the same as always, but it felt different. Smaller. Empty. Like it had already stopped belonging to me. I grabbed a small bag and started packing the few things I had: some clothes, a notebook, and a pen. Nothing valuable, nothing impressive, just pieces of a life I was about to leave behind. For a moment, I paused and looked around. This room had seen all my quiet struggles, my late nights, my silent tears. And yet, it had never protected me from feeling alone. I realized then that leaving wasn't just about proving something to my father. It was about saving myself. I walked back into the living room with my bag. No one tried to stop me. My father didn't speak again. My mother still avoided my eyes. My brother's smirk faded slightly, but he said nothing. That silence told me everything I needed to know. I opened the door and stepped outside. The air felt different, colder, but somehow more honest. There was no comfort waiting for me out there, no guarantees, no safety, just uncertainty. I looked at the $10 one last time before putting it in my pocket. It wasn't enough to survive. I knew that. But it was enough to start. And sometimes a start is all you need. Disclaimer: this video is a work of fiction created for entertainment and inspirational purposes only. Any resemblance to real persons, companies, or events is purely coincidental. The first night outside felt longer than any night I had ever lived through. The moment the door closed behind me, reality hit in a way I wasn't prepared for. Inside that house, I had felt small and unwanted. But at least I had a roof over my head. Out here, there was nothing but open space and uncertainty. The sky was dark, the streets were quieter than usual, and every sound seemed louder, sharper, almost threatening. I walked without direction for a while, holding my small bag tightly against my side. I didn't know where I was going, and that was the most terrifying part. People passed by me without noticing, each of them busy with their own lives, their own destinations. It felt strange how the world kept moving as if nothing had changed, while for me, everything had collapsed in a single evening. Eventually, my legs grew tired, and I found a bench in a quiet corner of a park. It didn't look comfortable, but it was the only option I had. I sat down slowly, trying to convince myself that this was temporary, that I would figure something out in the morning. But as the hours passed, the cold began to creep in. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to stay warm, but it wasn't enough. Sleep didn't come easily. Every small noise made me alert. The rustling of leaves, distant footsteps, even the sound of cars passing by made my heart race. I realized how vulnerable I was. For the first time, I understood what it truly meant to have no place to go. Hunger hit me harder than I expected. At first, it was just a dull ache, something I thought I could ignore. But as time went on, it became sharper, more demanding. My stomach felt empty in a way I had never experienced before. That $10 I once held so tightly was already gone, spent on something small that didn't even last. Now, I had nothing left, not even enough for a simple meal. By morning, exhaustion had taken over. My body felt heavy, my mind slow. I looked around at the people starting their day, joggers, workers, students. They all had somewhere to be, something to do. I felt like I didn't belong in that picture anymore. Still, I forced myself to stand up. Sitting there wouldn't change anything. I needed work, any kind of work. Something to get me through the day. I started walking through nearby streets, looking at shops, offices, and small businesses. Every place I saw became a possibility in my mind. I walked into the first shop and asked if they were hiring. The answer was quick and simple: no. The second place didn't even let me finish my sentence. The third one barely looked at me before shaking their head. Rejection came faster than I could process it. Each no felt heavier than the last. It wasn't just about the job. It was about how people looked at me. Some saw me as inexperienced. Others saw me as a problem they didn't want to deal with. A few didn't see me at all. Hours passed like this. Walking, asking, hoping, and being turned away. My feet began to hurt, but I didn't stop. I couldn't afford to. Every minute without a job felt like I was getting closer to proving my father right. At one point, I stopped outside a small store and just stood there. My reflection in the glass caught my attention. I looked tired, my clothes slightly wrinkled, my face pale. I didn't look like someone anyone would hire. For a brief moment, doubt crept in. Maybe he was right. Maybe I wasn't ready for the world outside. The thought scared me more than anything else. Going back would mean hearing that laughter again. Seeing that look of disappointment. I couldn't do that. I wouldn't. I took a deep breath and kept walking. By the afternoon, the sun felt harsh, and my energy was almost gone. I hadn't eaten, hadn't rested properly, and hadn't found a single opportunity. Every step felt heavier, but something inside me kept pushing forward. That's when I saw a small cafe on the corner of the street. It didn't look special, just a simple place with a few tables and a quiet atmosphere. For a moment, I hesitated. I had already been rejected so many times. What difference would one more make? But something about that place felt different. Maybe it was the calmness, or maybe I was just out of options. I walked in slowly, my heart beating faster than it should. The smell of coffee filled the air, making my hunger even harder to ignore. A man stood behind the counter, looking busy but not unfriendly. I approached him and asked if they needed any help. My voice wasn't as confident as I wanted it to be, but I didn't let it shake. He looked at me for a moment, as if trying to decide something. I could see the hesitation in his eyes, the same hesitation I had seen everywhere else that day. But this time, he didn't say no immediately. Instead, he asked a simple question, one that felt like a small opening in a wall that had been closed all day. And in that moment, I realized, this could be my chance. Working at the cafe did not feel like success at first. It felt like survival, nothing more. My job was simple: clean tables, white counters, and carry dishes back and forth without making mistakes. It was the kind of work most people ignored, the kind that didn't get noticed unless something went wrong. But for me, it meant a chance to stand on my own feet, even if those feet were still shaking. The first few days were exhausting. I woke up early, even though I barely slept, and pushed myself to keep going no matter how tired I felt. My hands would ache from constant movement, and my back would hurt by the end of the day. But I never complained. I couldn't afford to. This job was more than just income. It was proof that I hadn't completely failed. The cafe itself was small, almost hidden between larger, more modern places. It didn't attract much attention, and most customers who came in looked like regulars who had been visiting for years. But even then, I could sense something was wrong. Orders took too long, tables stayed dirty for too long, and sometimes customers left before even being served. The atmosphere felt slow, almost stuck in time. At first, I told myself it wasn't my place to think about these things. I was just a worker, someone hired to do basic tasks. But the more I observed, the harder it became to ignore the problems. Every delay, every complaint, every frustrated customer stayed in my mind. It reminded me of something deeper, that things didn't have to stay broken if someone was willing to fix them. One evening, after closing time, I stayed back a little longer than usual. The owner was counting the day's earnings, his expression tired and slightly disappointed. I hesitated for a moment, unsure if I should speak. What if he laughed at me like my father did? What if he told me to just do my job and stop thinking beyond it? But something inside me pushed forward. I walked up to him and carefully suggested that there might be a way to make things faster and smoother. He looked at me with mild surprise, as if he hadn't expected anything beyond silence from me. At first, he didn't take me seriously. He gave a small, dismissive smile and said that running a business wasn't as easy as it looked. That moment felt familiar, almost too familiar. It echoed the same doubt I had faced before. But this time, I didn't step back. I explained my observations, how orders were being handled, how time was being wasted, how small changes can make a big difference. He didn't agree immediately, but he didn't shut me down either. That was enough. The next day, I asked if I could try something simple. I borrowed an old laptop that was barely working and spent hours figuring out a basic system to track orders more efficiently. It wasn't perfect, and I wasn't an expert. But I used whatever knowledge I could gather. I focused on making things clearer, faster, and easier to follow. When I finally showed it to him, he seemed unsure, but after a moment of silence, he agreed to let me try it for a day. That day changed everything. Orders started moving faster. There was less confusion between the kitchen and the front. Customers didn't have to wait as long, and for the first time, I noticed something different. People were smiling more. The cafe felt alive in a way it hadn't before. The owner watched everything closely. At the end of the day, he didn't say much, but his expression had changed. There was no doubt in his eyes this time, only curiosity and something close to respect. Over the next few weeks, I kept improving the system. Small changes turned into bigger ones. I organized tasks, suggested better ways to manage time, and even helped with basic customer handling. Slowly, the cafe started gaining more attention. New customers walked in, and regulars began to notice the difference. For me, the biggest change wasn't the cafe itself. It was how people started looking at me. I was no longer invisible. My opinions mattered, my efforts were recognized, and my presence had value. One evening, as I stood behind the counter helping with orders, I realized something important. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was building something, step by step, without even realizing it at first. And for the first time since I left home, I felt a quiet sense of control over my own life, something no one could take away from me anymore. The cafe had slowly become more than just a workplace for me. It was where I rebuilt myself, piece by piece, without anyone really noticing the transformation, except me. The days were still long, and the work was still tiring. But there was a new energy in everything I did. I wasn't just following instructions anymore. I was thinking, improving, and growing. Customers now walked in with expectations, and most of the time, they left satisfied. That alone felt like a quiet victory. Among the regular customers, there was one man who stood out, though I didn't realize his importance at first. He would come in almost every afternoon, order the same coffee, and sit in the same corner. He was observant but quiet, often watching the flow of the cafe more than engaging in conversations. At first I thought he was just another customer enjoying his routine, but over time I noticed how his eyes followed the changes happening around him. One evening, after I had helped resolve a small issue with a delayed order, he called me over. His tone was calm, but there was a certain sharpness in his gaze, like he was trying to understand something deeper. He asked me how long I had been working there. I told him honestly, it hadn't been very long. He seemed surprised, but he didn't question it further. Instead, he asked something unexpected. He wanted to know if I was the one responsible for the improvements in the cafe. For a moment, I hesitated. I wasn't used to being directly recognized like that. But I nodded. There was no point hiding it. He leaned back slightly, as if confirming a thought he already had. Then he said something that caught me completely off guard. He told me he owned a small tech company and had been watching how I handled things over the past few weeks. He was impressed not just by the changes I made, but by how I observed problems and acted on them without being told. I didn't know how to respond. Opportunities like that didn't just appear out of nowhere, especially not for someone like me. I was still trying to find stability, still trying to prove to myself that I belonged somewhere. But the way he spoke wasn't casual. It felt intentional, like he had already made a decision before even speaking to me. He offered me an internship at his company. The word itself felt heavy, almost unreal. I had never imagined stepping into something like that so soon. A part of me was excited, but another part was afraid. What if I wasn't ready? What if I failed again, just like my father had always expected? I asked him why he chose me. Out of all the people he could have picked, why someone working in a small cafe? He gave a simple answer. Skills can be taught, he said, but mindset is rare. He believed I had the kind of mindset that couldn't be trained easily. The ability to notice what others ignore and the willingness to take action without waiting for permission. That answer stayed with me long after he left. That night, I couldn't sleep properly. My mind kept going back and forth between doubt and hope. This was more than just a job. It was a doorway into a completely different world. A world I had never been part of before. Accepting it meant stepping into the unknown again, just like the day I left home. But this time, the risk felt different. It wasn't about survival anymore. It was about growth. The next day, I gave him my answer. I said yes. Walking into his office for the first time felt like entering a different reality. Everything was organized, fast-paced, and filled with people who seemed to know exactly what they were doing. I felt out of place at first, like I didn't belong among them. But I reminded myself why I was there. I had earned this chance. The learning curve was steep. I had to understand systems, business operations, and technical processes that were completely new to me. There were moments when I felt overwhelmed, when I questioned whether I had made the right decision. But every time doubt appeared, I pushed myself harder. I stayed late, asked questions, and observed everything carefully. Slowly, things started to make sense. Then one day, during a meeting, I was reviewing some company files when a familiar name caught my attention. At first, I thought it was a coincidence, but as I looked closer, my heart began to beat faster. It wasn't just a similar name. It was my father's company. For a moment, everything around me faded. The voices in the room, the movement, the discussion, it all blurred into the background. I stared at the screen, trying to process what I was seeing. The same company that had always been a symbol of his pride, the same place he believed defined success. And now, somehow, I was sitting in a position where I could see it from the inside. Seeing my father's company name on the screen did not feel like victory. It felt like a sudden pull into the past I had tried so hard to leave behind. My chest tightened, and for a moment I forgot where I was. The meeting continued around me, voices discussing numbers, strategies, and risks. But my focus stayed locked on that one detail. It was strange how something so familiar could feel so distant at the same time. I forced myself to stay calm. No one in that room knew who I was connected to, and I intended to keep it that way. Revealing the truth would only complicate things. I had worked too hard to be seen for my abilities, not for my past. So I stayed quiet, listening carefully as the discussion moved forward. As the meeting progressed, I started to understand the situation more clearly. The company was not in a strong position. In fact, it was struggling more than I could have imagined. The report showed declining profits, missed targets, and growing inefficiencies. The structure seemed outdated, and decision-making processes were slow and inconsistent. It was not the powerful, untouchable place my father had always described at home. That realization brought a mix of emotions. Part of me felt shocked, almost confused. How could something he had always spoken about with so much pride be falling apart like this? But another part of me felt something deeper, something harder to define. It was not satisfaction, and it was not anger. It was understanding. For the first time, I saw that his confidence had not been built on strength alone. It had also been built on illusion. Over the next few days, I started studying the company more closely. I went to reports, observed patterns, and paid attention to details others seemed to overlook. The problems were not random. They were consistent and connected. Poor communication between departments, outdated systems that slowed everything down, and leadership decisions that focused more on short-term fixes than long-term stability. It reminded me of the Café in its early days. Only this time, the scale was much larger and the consequences much heavier. I kept my distance emotionally. I did not allow myself to think of it as my father's company. I treated it like any other case, any other business that needed solutions. That separation was necessary. If I let personal feelings take over, I would lose clarity. And clarity was the one thing I could not afford to lose. At the same time, I noticed something else. No one in the company seemed to fully understand the depth of the problem. They saw the symptoms but not the cause. They tried to fix individual issues without addressing the system as a whole. It was like patching cracks in a wall without realizing the foundation was weakening. That was where I saw an opportunity. I started making notes, connecting different pieces of information, and building a clearer picture in my mind. Every report I read, every discussion I listened to, added another layer to my understanding. I did not rush to share my thoughts. I knew that timing mattered. Speaking too early could mean being ignored. I needed to be precise, confident, and prepared. During this time, I also worked on other projects, continuing to prove myself in smaller ways. Each success built trust, not just in how others saw me, but in how I saw myself. I was no longer the person holding her last $10, unsure of where to go. I was someone who could analyze, decide, and act. Still, there were moments when memories tried to return. My father's voice, his laughter, his certainty about my failure. Those thoughts appeared quietly, usually when I was alone. But they did not control me anymore. Instead, they became a reminder of why I needed to stay focused. One evening, while reviewing more detailed financial data, I noticed something critical. The company was not just struggling, it was approaching a point where recovery would become much harder if changes were not made soon. The margin for error was shrinking. Time was no longer on their side. That realization changed everything. It was no longer just about understanding the problem. It was about acting before it was too late. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes for a moment, organizing everything in my mind. The patterns were clear now. The solutions were forming. Not perfectly, but strongly enough to build upon. I knew what needed to be done, and more importantly, I knew I was capable of doing it. For the first time, the idea of control entered my thoughts in a serious way. Not control over people, but control over outcomes. The ability to shape something instead of just reacting to it. It was a powerful realization, one that felt both exciting and dangerous. I opened my eyes and looked at the data again, this time with a different perspective. This was no longer just another project. It was a turning point, whether anyone else realized it yet or not. The day I was assigned to lead the restructuring project felt unreal, like something that should have belonged to someone else. I remember sitting in the meeting room when my supervisor announced it. A major client company needed urgent operational restructuring, and the team was being selected based on performance and analytical ability. My name was included without hesitation. I nodded calmly, but inside, my thoughts were moving faster than I could control. They gave me the files first. When I opened them, I already knew what I was going to see. The same patterns, the same weaknesses, the same structural problems I had been studying in silence for days. And at the top of the file, clearly printed, with the name I had tried not to think about too often, my father's company. I did not react outwardly. I simply closed the file for a moment and took a slow breath. No one in the room noticed anything unusual. To them, it was just another assignment. To me, it was something far heavier. It was not just business anymore. It was history I had walked away from, now placed directly in my hands. The first official meeting with the client was scheduled 2 days later. I spent those 2 days preparing more intensely than I ever had before. I studied every detail, every department report, every financial trend. I built a mental map of the company, layer by layer. I did not allow myself to think emotionally. If I did, I knew it would affect my clarity. On the day of the meeting, I arrived early. The building was familiar in a way that made my stomach tighten, but I kept my expression steady. The conference room was large, filled with senior executives, managers, and decision-makers. I chose a seat that allowed me to observe everything without drawing unnecessary attention. Then I saw him. My father walked in with the rest of the senior team. He looked the same as I remembered: confident posture, controlled expression, the kind of presence that used to make people quiet instantly at home. But here, I saw something different too. There was tension in his movements, something less stable than before. He did not recognize me. That realization should have made things easier. Instead, it made everything more complicated. I had imagined this moment many times, but none of those versions had prepared me for how calm I would need to be in reality. The meeting began. Senior managers presented their reports, highlighting issues, losses, and inefficiencies. My father spoke with authority, defending certain decisions while acknowledging others. I listened carefully, taking notes, watching how the conversation unfolded. There was pride in his voice, but also frustration hidden between lines. When it was my turn to speak, I stood up slowly. Every eye in the room shifted toward me. I introduced myself briefly, keeping my tone professional and controlled. I did not mention anything personal. That was not the place for it. Then I began my analysis. I explained the core issues one by one, but not as separate problems. I showed how they were connected, how outdated systems slowed decision-making, how communication gaps created repeated errors, how short-term thinking was damaging long-term growth. As I spoke, I noticed the shift in the room. At first, there was skepticism, then attention, then silence. I did not rush. I made sure every point was clear, supported by data, not emotion. I had learned that people do not accept ideas because they are true. They accept them when they are presented in a way they cannot ignore. My father's expression changed gradually as I spoke. First confusion, then focus, then something I could not immediately read. He leaned slightly forward, listening more carefully than before, but he still did not recognize me. After my presentation, I proposed a restructuring plan. It was not simple. It required changes in leadership structure, workflow redesign, and system modernization. It also required accountability at levels that had been avoided for a long time. I explained each step carefully, showing not just what needed to change, but how it could be done. The room stayed quiet after I finished. Some of the executives exchanged looks. A few nodded slowly. Others remained uncertain. My supervisor finally spoke, asking for opinions from the senior team. My father spoke next. He questioned parts of the plan, not aggressively but with caution. He asked for clarifications, tested certain assumptions. I answered each question directly. No hesitation, no uncertainty. I treated every concern as valid and responded with precision. As the discussion continued, something shifted. Resistance began to soften. Not because everyone agreed immediately, but because the logic behind the plan was difficult to dismiss. By the end of the meeting, no final decision was made. But something important had changed. The plan was no longer just an idea. It was now under serious consideration. As people began to leave the room, I stayed behind briefly, organizing my notes. My father stood a few steps away, still reviewing the documents I had presented. For a moment I thought he might say something more, but he didn't. He simply looked at the papers again, then at the screen, as if trying to understand something that felt familiar but unreachable. After the restructuring proposal was accepted for implementation, everything in my life began to move faster than I could fully process. What had started as analysis and planning was now turning into real execution. I was no longer just observing problems or suggesting solutions. I was actively shaping decisions that affected an entire company. The responsibility felt heavier each day, but at the same time, it gave me a strange sense of control I had never experienced before. The first few weeks were intense. I worked closely with different departments, coordinating changes, reviewing systems, and monitoring progress. Every improvement required careful adjustment. Nothing worked perfectly at the first attempt, and I had to constantly refine my approach. But slowly, the results started to show. Processes became faster, communication improved, and operational delays began to reduce. The company was not fully stable yet, but it was clearly moving in a better direction. During this time, I kept my focus strictly professional. I avoided unnecessary attention and stayed committed to the work. I knew that success in this environment depended not just on ideas, but on consistency. People were watching, even if they did not always express it directly. Trust was something that had to be earned repeatedly through action, not words. What I did not expect was how quickly internal interest in my work would grow. Senior members of the organization began discussing my involvement more frequently. At first, I remained in the background, but gradually I was included in higher-level discussions. Each step forward brought more visibility, and with it, more responsibility. One afternoon, I was called into a private meeting with a group of senior executives. The atmosphere was different from previous meetings. There was less formality and more directness. They spoke about the future of the company, its current leadership challenges, and the need for stronger direction during this transition phase. I listened carefully, understanding that this was not just a review meeting. It was a discussion about control. They began talking about ownership structures, shares, and decision-making authority. I realized that the company was not only struggling operationally, but also internally, unstable at the leadership level. There were disagreements among stakeholders, unclear authority lines, and increasing pressure from investors who wanted stability. It became clear that change was not optional anymore. Over the following weeks, financial negotiations started quietly in the background. Investors who had initially shown interest in the restructuring results began asking more serious questions about long-term involvement. My role in the project made me a central point of reference in many of these discussions. I was no longer just the analyst. I was becoming part of the strategic direction itself. At the same time, I learned something important. A portion of the company's shares was becoming available due to internal restructuring agreements and financial adjustments. It was not openly discussed in public, but within certain circles, it was understood that ownership was shifting. Investors were being invited to stabilize the company through partial acquisition. This was the moment I started thinking differently. Up until then, my focus had been on fixing problems. But now I began to see something larger. Fixing the company was one thing, but controlling its direction was something else entirely. If the wrong decisions were made at the ownership level, everything I had worked for could eventually collapse again. I did not rush into anything. Instead, I began analyzing the financial structure in detail. I studied share distribution, investment patterns, and future projections. I understood that influence in a company was not only about position, it was about ownership. The more control you had, the more stability you could ensure. During one of the late-night sessions at the office, I received an update from the financial team. A significant portion of shares was being offered to select investors as part of a restructuring agreement. It was an opportunity to bring in stable partners who could support long-term recovery. That was when I made my decision. I contacted the relevant channels quietly and initiated the process of acquiring shares. It was not a sudden emotional decision. It was calculated, based on everything I had observed and learned. The goal was not just involvement anymore. It was stability, and stability required authority. The process took time. There were formal evaluations, legal procedures, and financial verifications. Throughout it all, I remained focused on my responsibilities within the company, continuing to ensure that operational improvements stayed on track. I did not allow external processes to distract me from internal progress. Then came the final confirmation. My acquisition had been approved. My shareholding was now officially recognized. It was not a full takeover, but it was enough to place me in a position of real influence within the company's structure. I was no longer just an external consultant or project lead. I was now part of the ownership framework. When the internal announcement was made, reactions varied. Some were surprised, others curious, and a few quietly concerned. But I did not focus on that. My attention remained on the bigger picture. A few days later, another high-level meeting was scheduled. This time, the discussion was about the future leadership direction of the company. The existing leadership structure was under review due to ongoing instability and financial pressure. A new executive board configuration was being considered to ensure long-term recovery. As I entered the meeting room, I noticed a shift in atmosphere. There was a different kind of attention directed toward me now. Not just as a contributor, but as someone whose position mattered in decision-making. The discussion was long and detailed. Different proposals were presented, debated, and evaluated. Eventually, after several rounds of consideration, a new structure was agreed upon. I was formally included in the strategic decision-making framework of the company. It was a turning point that changed everything quietly but permanently. The morning of the final meeting felt different from any other day I had experienced in the company. There was no rush in my steps, no nervous anticipation, but a steady calm that had taken time to build. Everything I had done until now had led to this point, whether I had realized it at the beginning or not. The decisions, the risks, the long nights, and the silent calculations had all converged into something irreversible. The meeting was announced internally as a major strategic review. Key stakeholders, board members, and senior executives were expected to attend. The agenda was simple on paper, but heavy in meaning: final approval of the new ownership and leadership structure, In reality, it was the moment where everything would be officially recognized and settled. When I arrived at the building, I noticed subtle differences in how people behaved around me. The same staff who once barely acknowledged my presence now greeted me with cautious respect. I did not respond differently than before. I kept my expression steady, my focus internal. Respect gained too quickly often comes with confusion, and I had no intention of feeding uncertainty. Inside the meeting room, the atmosphere was formal, but tense. Documents were arranged neatly on the table, screens were prepared for presentations, and everyone took their seats in a controlled silence. I chose my seat deliberately, not at the head, but in a position where I could observe everything clearly. Then the door opened and my father walked in. For a brief moment, nothing changed outwardly. He was still composed, still carrying the same controlled presence he always had, but I noticed the smallest pause in his step when he saw me. It was not recognition yet, but something close to curiosity, as if my presence felt familiar in a way he could not immediately place. He sat down without saying anything. I did the same. The meeting began with formal presentations about the company's current status and the proposed final structure. Financial improvements were highlighted, operational changes were reviewed, and the results of the restructuring were presented in detail. The numbers showed clear recovery. The company was no longer in crisis, it was stabilizing. Then came the ownership segment. This was the part I had already prepared for mentally. The legal representatives explained the finalized share distribution and updated governance structure. Names were listed, roles were clarified, and authority levels were defined. And then my name appeared. There was a brief pause in the room, not dramatic, but noticeable. A few heads turned slightly, a few eyes shifted between documents and the screen. My position within the structure was now officially confirmed. I was not just part of the system anymore. I was part of its foundation. I remained still. My father looked at the screen again, then at the document in front of him. Slowly, his expression began to change. At first, it was confusion, like he was trying to connect something that did not immediately make sense. Then hesitation appeared, and finally, recognition. I could see the exact moment it happened. His eyes lifted toward me again, but this time differently. Not as an employee, not as a consultant, but as someone he was finally beginning to recognize. The silence between us became heavier, not because of noise, but because of understanding. He did not speak immediately. The room continued with formal explanations, but I could feel that his attention was no longer on the documents. After the presentations ended, the room moved into final discussions. People spoke about future plans, stability measures, and long-term expectations. I contributed when necessary, maintaining clarity and control in my responses. But I could feel my father's gaze occasionally returning to me, as if he was still trying to confirm what he was seeing. Eventually, the meeting reached its conclusion. The structure was officially approved. Signatures were completed, confirmations were recorded, and decisions were finalized. It was no longer a proposal. It was reality. As people began to leave the room, conversations resumed in low voices, chairs moved, and documents were gathered. I stayed seated for a moment longer, reviewing the final notes in front of me. Then I felt a presence nearby. My father had not left. He stood a few steps away, looking at me directly now. The room was almost empty, giving the moment a quiet weight. There was no audience anymore, no formal structure. Only two people facing each other in a space that felt both familiar and distant. He finally spoke. His voice was lower than usual, less certain but controlled. He asked if it was really me, not in disbelief, but in an attempt to understand what he was seeing. I did not respond immediately. I looked at him for a moment, not with anger, not with revenge, but with calm clarity. The silence between us held everything that had been unsaid for years. Then I answered simply, confirming who I was, without emotion, without explanation beyond what was necessary. For a moment, he said nothing. The confidence that once defined him seemed quieter now, replaced by something more reflective. He looked away briefly, then back again, as if trying to process not just my presence, but the path that had led here. I did not continue the conversation further. There was no need for long explanations or emotional confrontation. Everything that had happened before had already spoken louder than words. I stood up, gathered my notes, and prepared to leave the room. The meeting was over. The structure was finalized, and the company had entered a new phase of stability. As I walked out, the space behind me remained silent, carrying the weight of everything that had just been realized without needing to be spoken aloud. The story closes not with noise, but with silence that speaks louder than words ever could. From being dismissed with nothing but $10 to standing at the center of a powerful company, her journey reflects how patience, intelligence, and quiet determination can reshape destiny. The same voice that was once laughed at is now the one that leads decisions, not through revenge alone, but through undeniable growth. And as the past fades into distance, what remains is a reminder that true power is not taken in a moment, it is built step by step, until no one can ignore it anymore.